Gardens began in 1816, but this place has a much older and in many ways a much more interesting history. So we're standing on a land known as Gadi. The traditional custodians of this place are the Gadigal people, and they and the other 29 cultural groups that make up the Eora Nation in the Sydney Basin were the first Aboriginal communities to have to deal with a permanent European settlement. And that happened just down the road from here. And when we stand in this part of the gardens, we can see on our left-hand side plants growing here before European settlement, and on the right-hand side plants that you'll be very familiar. A number of the herbs common in our cooking. We've got orange trees, we've got cotton, bananas, tobacco, and the reason for that is this is amongst the first land on the whole continent cleared by Europeans. In fact, it's the first land cleared by Europeans to try and establish an agricultural enterprise, which became known as the first farm. So in 1788, after Governor Phillip brought those 11 ships to Sydney Cove in an enterprise that I think we could only compare in modern terms to going to Mars. They were coming halfway across the world with 1,200 people to a continent where Europeans had only fleetingly visited. In case of this part of the east coast of Australia, Cook was here with Banks and Solander for only 8 days. So he arrives there with ships laden like Noah's Ark. They bring plants with them, they bring animals with them. They bring seed from England and Europe, but they stop along the way. They pick up plants in the Canary Islands, in Rio de Janeiro, and also in Cape Town at the tip of South Africa. They bring them here. It's this land that they first clear, and Phillip chooses it for two reasons. And one of those reasons kind of if you like, makes a mockery of the concept of the first farm. So one reason he chooses it is because there's a creek here. So there's a run of fresh water, not as important a run of fresh water as the tank stream in Sydney Cove, but he sees the water there, but he also notes that the trees stood a little bit further apart in this part of the landscape, making it the obvious place to clear. So by July 1788, convicts have cleared 9 acres and they start growing grain. It's a total failure. The soil is very low in nutrients. Despite the vegetation looking lush to Cook, to Banks, and even to Phillip, the soils are very ancient and the plants have adapted to growing with very low fertility rates, and particularly very low in phosphorus. So the grains fail, the creek dries up, but that idea of Phillip that the trees stood a little bit further apart points to a possible practice going on here for 40 to 60,000 years by the Gadigal people, and that was using fire to manipulate the landscape, to reduce the amount of canopy, also to make clearer walking trails, but most importantly to allow more light to the ground, to allow the growth of grasses like this kangaroo grass here. So that grass, the new shoots, and you can see some coming up here today, encouraged animals which may have been coming to the creek anyway, which could be hunted, but also that grass has an edible grain, and we know from discoveries at Cuddy Springs that that grain has been ground by Aboriginal cultural groups for at least 32,000 years to make a rudimentary bread. So it makes Aboriginal people the oldest bread making culture on the planet by about 15 to 17,000 years. So the idea that this was the first farm is ironic, because it could well be the oldest place where people have been continuously practicing the manipulation of the landscape and the plants within it to provide food. And if that isn't some form of agriculture or farming, then I'm not sure what is. Done.